Some men vanish with a bang, others simply fade. My father was the fading kind. For years he existed like a shadow at the edge of my life. There, but never really with me. Not cruel, not unkind, just quiet. Too quiet. After my mother died, he became even more distant. Phone calls turned into voicemails. Holidays came and went. Time, that relentless thief, crept in between us until we were nothing more than shared DNA and the echo of old routines. Then one morning, I got a call from a nurse. My father had collapsed, alone. I hadn't seen him in almost a year. What I found when I stepped back into his life wasn't the man I remembered, but the remnants of someone who had been silently preparing to disappear. No goodbyes, no requests, just a drawer full of secrets, a half-written letter, and a quiet man who thought the world would be better off without him. This is the story of what happened next, not of death, but of return, of forgiveness that came not through words, but through presence, of healing in the most unexpected ways, and of the things a father leaves behind, not in a will, but in the spaces he once occupied and the hearts he almost missed. This isn't a dramatic story, but it's real, and sometimes real is more than enough. Robert Harrison stood motionless before the bathroom mirror, head tilted slightly toward the overhead light. It was still there, of course. The lump, no smaller than yesterday, perhaps a bit larger, rounder at the edges, angry and purplish beneath the weathered canvas of his neck. A slow, steady pulse rippled beneath its surface, as if it had grown its own heartbeat, one that beat in defiance of his will, of time, of everything he had chosen to ignore. He adjusted the scarf around his neck, wincing as the soft wool grazed the skin stretched taut over the mass. The touch stung, like a bruise that had turned territorial. With a slow, practiced breath, he reached for his toothbrush, but his hand hesitated midair. He didn't move, didn't blink, just stared. The mirror, like everything else in this apartment, was from another life, slightly fogged with age and calcium at the edges, framing a man he barely recognized. A man with hollows under his eyes and shoulders that had once carried weight, real weight, emotional weight, now slumped from years of carrying ghosts. From down the hall, the ancient answering machine clicked and buzzed. A mechanical voice played through the cracked speaker. "Dad, it's James. I'm coming tomorrow, whether you like it or not." Click. No preamble, no sugarcoating. That was James, all grown up and full of confrontation. Robert lowered the toothbrush and walked toward the hallway, leaning slightly to his left, as if gravity had shifted beneath his feet. The pill bottle on the kitchen counter rattled as he picked it up, fingers trembling just enough to make the task feel like defusing a bomb. 3 tablets remained. The label, once crisp and white, had yellowed and curled at the edges. He didn't need to read it. He knew exactly what it said, knew it by heart. Take once daily, with food, refill required. The cap squeaked open. He dry swallowed 1 tablet and dropped the bottle back onto the counter with a hollow plastic clack. Then he leaned forward, bracing himself on the edge of the sink. The world tilted slightly, just enough to make his stomach churn. Some clocks, Robert thought, you couldn't reset. You just lived with the ticking until it stopped. The calendar on the wall beside the fridge tilted to the right, one corner sagging where the tack had pulled loose. Each month was marred by thick red X's, drawn over missed appointments. Doctor's visits mostly. Checkups he had never intended to keep. He remembered crossing them out. The deliberate pressure of the marker, the relief. In the living room, dust danced in a shaft of light that filtered through the blinds, making the stale air look alive. The radiator clanked in defiance of the June warmth outside, echoing through the apartment like an old machine that no longer knew its purpose, but continued out of habit. Robert moved slowly toward his recliner, easing himself down with the groan of old springs and older bones. He scanned the room. It was full of silences, some fresh, some ancient. On the mantel, a line of photographs remained untouched, Eleanor's smile forever frozen mid-laugh in glossy sepia. Next to her, a framed picture of James at his college graduation. James in his cap and gown, Robert behind him in a suit he hadn't worn since, and beside that, a case of service medals. Korea. Years he rarely spoke of, years that clung to him in the quiet moments between breaths. The medals, now dulled with time, glinted faintly in the half-light. Proof of honor, or perhaps penance. Robert pulled the checkered scarf tighter. He hated that it had become a fixture, that it was no longer a choice but a necessity. People stared less when he wore it, asked fewer questions. The scarf had become a boundary, a polite lie. The phone hadn't rung again, not since James's message. He knew his son. knew that voice, tight, controlled, angry in a way that only disappointment could shape. It wasn't the kind of anger that exploded. It was the kind that simmered for decades, quiet and sharp. It had been 6 months since they'd last spoken. Or perhaps longer. The passage of time had blurred for Robert, especially in this apartment, where days bled into one another, measured only by how loud the radiator clicked or how much colder his feet felt at night. He reached for the handkerchief tucked beside the chair arm and brought it to his lips. There was blood. Again. A deep, rusty crimson on white fabric. He folded it neatly and set it aside without comment, without reaction, like clearing the dinner table after a meal no one enjoyed. He looked at the front door. James would walk through it soon, with his overnight bag and his tightly wound nerves, and his eyes that mirrored Eleanor's in color, but not in softness. There would be words, accusations, offers of help disguised as commands, and Robert would resist, not because he was stubborn, but because he didn't know how not to. In the stillness, Robert reached for the remote and clicked the TV on, the sound turned down low. A cooking show flickered to life. The host was demonstrating how to debone a chicken. Robert watched for a moment, then turned the volume off entirely. He didn't want sound, just motion. Something to fill the silence without challenging it. He closed his eyes, and in that moment, between one heartbeat and the next, he almost believed he could disappear. The knock came precisely at 9:07 a.m. Not a ringing bell, not a call from the lobby, but the measured, deliberate sound of knuckles against wood. 3 times. Then silence. Robert sat in his armchair, unmoving. The scarf around his neck had slipped slightly, revealing the swollen curve of the lump beneath. He didn't adjust it. Instead, he stared at the door, as if by sheer will he might unhear the knock. But it came again, softer this time, followed by a pause that felt infinite. The doorknob turned with a creak. James had always kept a key, and Robert, in all his silent defiance, had never asked for it back. When the door opened, the stale air inside collided with the faint scent of aftershave and cold outside wind. James stepped in, tall and tense, suitcase in one hand, phone in the other. He didn't speak. His eyes swept the room in a slow practice scan, the same way a firefighter checks for smoke before the flames show themselves. Robert looked smaller than James remembered. Shrunk not by time alone, but by something less tangible, an erosion of presence, of vitality. The apartment was dim, lit only by the gray morning filtering through the blinds. Dust motes shimmered in the light, suspended like unanswered questions. James set his suitcase down, the soft thump sounding far louder than it should have. Still, no words, just breath. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the hiss of the radiator. The living room looked unchanged, and yet everything felt wrong. A faint smell clung to the air, not rot, but a kind of fatigue. Old newspapers were stacked by the fireplace, some dating back months. A dish towel, slightly damp, hung limp on the kitchen counter. The sink held a single plate, crusted over from a meal that had long ceased to be food. James removed his coat slowly, folding it with military precision and draping it over the back of a chair. He looked at his father then, truly looked, and noticed the way Robert's shoulders hunched not from posture but from pain. The scarf was wrong, too high on one side, hiding more than just skin. Something shifted in James's chest, something too heavy to name. Robert nodded, almost imperceptibly. That was his welcome. James sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, hands clasped. He studied the familiar room, every object infused with memory, the old lamp with the cracked base, the bookshelf stuffed with yellowed paperbacks, their spines bent like tired soldiers, the photograph of Eleanor on the end table, dust tracing the edge of her frame. Still, no one spoke. In the silence, James's eyes caught something. A small folded handkerchief placed carefully atop the TV remote, white fabric with a lace edge. At first it looked clean, then he saw it, a dark rust-colored smear in the center. Not recent, but unmistakable. Blood. He leaned forward slightly, trying not to stare, but he couldn't help it. The stain was dense, soaked through, not a drop but a surge, and the way it had been folded, deliberately, almost reverently, suggested it was not the first time, nor the last. His eyes flicked to his father's neck, to the scarf that clung too tightly, to the curve beneath it. He hadn't noticed at first, but now with the angle of the light he could see it, just a hint of swelling pushing against the fabric like something alive. James's stomach turned. Still, he said nothing. Instead, he stood and moved toward the window. The city outside bustled in quiet indifference. Delivery trucks, dog walkers, the distant wail of a siren. Life continued. It always did. Behind him, Robert adjusted his position in the chair, a wince barely disguised as a sigh. The lump was pressing harder today. He could feel its weight in every swallow, every breath. But the worst part wasn't the pain. It was that his son had noticed. James turned slowly, catching his father's eyes for the briefest of moments before Robert looked away. There it was again. That silence, that practiced evasion, a language they had spoken for years, fluent in omission. James wanted to ask, about the lump, about the blood, about the nights Robert must have sat in this room, terrified and alone, waiting for something to end or begin, but the words caught in his throat, stuck behind years of pride and restraint. Instead, he walked to the mantel and picked up a photograph, himself at age 10, holding a fish almost too large for his hands, Robert beside him, smiling faintly. That day had been perfect, the last perfect day maybe. He set the photo down carefully and turned back toward his father. "Okay if I stay in the guest room?" he asked, voice low, neutral. Robert nodded once, and that was it. No conversation, no questions, just the shared weight of unspoken things pressing in from every side. James walked down the hallway, each footstep soft against the aging carpet. As he passed the bathroom, the door hung slightly ajar. He glanced in, saw the bottle of prescription pills on the counter, the sink rimmed with faint traces of dried blood. He closed the door without a word. In the guest room, the bed had been made, recently, clumsily. A single sheet stretched tight, corners tucked with military discipline. James sat down on the edge, the springs creaking beneath him. He looked at the floor, then at the suitcase still zipped shut. He hadn't expected a warm welcome, but he also hadn't expected this, the heavy silence of a man preparing for absence, the handkerchief, the scarf, the stain. James exhaled long and slow. Something was wrong. Deeper than denial, older than fear, he would ask tomorrow, or maybe the day after. The following morning arrived muted and gray, the kind of colorless light that made every corner of the apartment seem more tired than the day before. The air inside remained still, thick with the residue of things left unsaid. Robert sat at the small kitchen table, nursing a lukewarm cup of instant coffee. The scarf still hung around his neck, but looser now, like a soldier returning from battle and letting down his guard, just slightly. James stood at the counter, peeling a banana with slow deliberation, his back half turned to his father. The silence between them had shape now, longer, denser. Neither of them knew how to cut through it, nor did they try. Robert's hands trembled faintly as he brought the coffee to his lips. He tried to hide it, wrapping both hands around the mug, but the tremor traveled up through his arms, a quiet betrayal of muscle and nerve. His vision blurred for a second, the room dipping slightly to the left before it righted itself again. He blinked hard and said nothing. James glanced over his shoulder. "Did you eat anything?" Robert gave a non-committal shrug. A yes, a no, maybe both. It was the only answer he ever gave when it came to food these days. James returned to the fridge and opened it, scanning its contents like a stranger in someone else's home. Inside, an expired carton of milk, a takeout container with a date scribbled in faded marker, and half a jar of peanut butter. "Dad," he said, voice lower this time. "This isn't food. This is garbage." Robert didn't look up. "Don't make a fuss." "I'm not making a fuss," James replied, closing the fridge harder than he meant to. "I'm pointing out the obvious." The two men stood in the same room, but occupied entirely different emotional landscapes. Robert sipped his coffee again, swallowing slowly, deliberately, as though each movement had to be negotiated with some invisible adversary beneath his skin. Then, without warning, he coughed, a dry, hollow sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest. It echoed sharply through the small kitchen. The cup slipped from his hands, hitting the table's edge and toppling onto the floor, shattering in 3 pieces. Brown liquid sprayed across the linoleum like an accusation. James turned sharply. "Dad?" Robert stood or tried to. His knees buckled before he'd fully pushed away from the chair. For a split second, he seemed suspended in the air, the way a tree sways before falling. Then he crumpled, first to one knee, then all the way down, his body folding like paper. James was beside him in 2 seconds, his hand under his father's head, fingers scrambling for signs, pulse, breath, eye response. The scarf had come loose in the fall, revealing the full swell of the lump, now an angry shade of violet, the skin stretched thin and shiny. "Jesus Christ," James muttered under his breath. "Dad, can you hear me?" Robert's eyes fluttered open for half a second, then closed again. His mouth moved without sound, trying to form words that couldn't reach the surface. James didn't wait. He pulled out his phone and dialed 911, his voice tight, clipped, controlled. Yes. I need an ambulance. 72 Emerson Street. Male, late 70s. Collapsed, shallow breathing. Possible mass on the neck. Yes, conscious but fading. He barely heard the dispatcher's voice as he dropped the phone on speaker and knelt back down. Stay with me, Dad. You hear me? Don't go anywhere. Time stretched. The sound of sirens in the distance started faint, then grew louder until they pierced through the morning like needles through fabric. The paramedics arrived in a blur. Blue gloves, black boots, and practiced efficiency. They asked questions James couldn't fully answer. Words like duration of symptoms, difficulty swallowing, neurological episodes. All he could offer were guesses. He hasn't told me anything, James said, voice cracking with frustration and helplessness. Robert was loaded onto the gurney, the scarf tucked hastily into a bag along with his wallet and keys. James followed the stretcher down the stairs, 2 steps behind, watching the sway of his father's arm as it dangled off the side, pale and limp with the skin beneath the wrists speckled in old bruises. At the hospital, the air was cold and white and sterile. Machines beeped with impersonal rhythm, and nurses moved briskly past. James sat outside the examination room, elbows on knees, hands gripping one another as if he could wring sense from the moment. Dr. Miller appeared in a white coat too large for his narrow frame, holding a clipboard and a face full of guarded professionalism. We've stabilized him, he said. He has a significant mass along the carotid sheath, pressing dangerously close to several vital arteries. That combined with what appears to be some systemic weakness. This wasn't his first episode, was it? James swallowed. I don't know. He didn't tell me anything. Miller gave a small nod, the kind that said he understood, and also didn't. We'll need to run further tests. But this mass, it's serious. He'll need a scan. Possibly a biopsy. We won't know more until we see how aggressive it is. The word hung in the air like smoke. Aggressive. James nodded, though the meaning didn't fully sink in. Miller continued, softer now. You're listed as next of kin. Do you want to be contacted with updates? James looked through the glass at his father, unmoving, wrapped in wires and linen, reduced to readings on a monitor. Yes, he said finally. Tell me everything. The apartment was colder than James remembered. He stepped inside and closed the door behind him, letting the silence fall over his shoulders like a thick, dusty coat. The air smelled faintly of old coffee, wood polish, and time, the kind that collects in the corners of untouched rooms and waits. He hadn't meant to come back alone, but the nurse had asked for his father's toothbrush, glasses, and a change of clothes. A simple request, a logistical task. But as he stood in the entryway, looking at the quiet stillness of his childhood home, it became something heavier. He walked down the hallway slowly, his footsteps soft against the carpet. The framed photos on the wall hadn't moved, hadn't aged, even as everyone inside them had. He paused briefly at a picture of his mother, Eleanor, laughing in a field, her hair caught mid-motion by the wind. He touched the edge of the frame with his thumb, then moved on. In the bedroom, sunlight pooled weakly across the bedspread. The room had the sterile orderliness of someone who lived in tight circles. One pillow, one blanket, a small table with a clock that no longer ticked. James opened the dresser drawers methodically. Socks, undershirts, a battered leather belt. He found a flannel shirt his father had worn every winter, the collar frayed at the tips, the scent of aftershave clinging to the fabric. On the nightstand sat a single book, well-worn and thick. The pages were soft at the edges, swollen slightly from years of use. It was a biography, someone obscure, someone forgotten. Robert had always preferred stories about men who had suffered and survived, but never boasted. James picked up the book to move it aside and felt something shift inside it. An unevenness between the pages. He thumbed through slowly until he found it, a folded piece of paper, yellowing at the creases, tucked between chapter 16 and 17. It was unmarked on the outside. No envelope, no date, just a single sheet, folded twice and worn smooth by time and handling. He hesitated for a moment before opening it, unsure of whether the paper was meant for him or never meant to be found at all. Inside, the handwriting was unmistakable, slanted slightly right, neat but faint in places, the ink bleeding where the hand had pressed too hard. It began without a salutation. No, dear James, no to whom it may concern. Just words, as if picked up mid-thought, mid-confession. If you're reading this, then I didn't make it, or maybe I changed my mind. I don't know yet. James sat down slowly on the edge of the bed, the paper trembling slightly in his hands. I've thought about this for a long time. Not because I want to die, but because I don't know how to keep living like this. Alone is one thing, but invisible, that's something else entirely. The doctors say the lump might be something. They don't know. I didn't let them find out. What's the point? I watched Eleanor waste away for 2 years while they ran tests and poked her like a lab rat. She was strong, stronger than me. And it didn't matter. I'm not scared of dying. I'm scared of dying while someone is watching me rot. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want you to remember me as something that fell apart. James stopped reading. The room swam around him, the edges softening. His throat ached, not from tears, he hadn't reached them yet, but from the pressure of what he was holding. He read on. You probably think I'm a coward. That's fair. I've been a poor father in many ways. Not cruel, just absent. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to show it. Eleanor was the bridge, and when she left, I lost the path. There were things I should have said, a lot of them, but time has a way of tricking you into thinking you'll always have more. If you're reading this and I'm gone, forgive me. If you're reading this and I'm still here, then maybe I found a reason to stay. That was where the letter ended. No signature, no final line, just a pen stroke trailing off into white space, as if Robert had paused and never returned. James folded the letter back along its original creases and set it on the nightstand beside the book. For a long moment he sat there, staring at the soft morning light slanting across the floor, thinking about all the things a man could live through and still remain a stranger to his own child. The letter wasn't long, it wasn't poetic, but it was real, and for James, that made it more powerful than any apology spoken aloud. He stood, gathered the clothes, and walked out of the room. But just before reaching the door, he turned back. Something compelled him, not curiosity, but instinct. He opened the top drawer of the nightstand and found nothing but spare batteries, a flashlight, and a small envelope addressed simply, "In case someone needs to know." Inside was a folded sheet with Robert's handwriting again, this time listing passwords, bank accounts, funeral preferences, quiet preparations made in silence. James tucked both letters into his coat pocket. On the way out, he paused once more at the photograph of Eleanor. Her eyes sparkled in frozen time, as if she knew everything, how it would fall apart, and how it might someday begin to come back together. He touched the frame again. "I found it," he said softly. Then he left, stepping back into the world, a different man than the one who had arrived. The hospital waiting room was a world of its own, sterile, air-conditioned, humming with fluorescent light and the quiet buzz of other people's emergencies. James sat in a stiff plastic chair near the window, a bag of his father's belongings resting at his feet. Outside, the city moved like it always had, indifferent, mechanical. Inside, time crawled. He'd brought the clothes, as the nurse had asked. The flannel shirt, socks, toothbrush, glasses. They were folded neatly in a canvas bag Robert must have used for years, the kind with worn leather corners and a zipper that always caught halfway. James hadn't checked the contents until now. He had just grabbed what looked necessary and left the apartment as quickly as he could, afraid that staying there longer would invite too many thoughts he wasn't ready to name. He leaned forward and unzipped the bag slowly, more to distract himself than out of need. The shirt was on top, soft with age. Beneath it, tucked between 2 rolled pairs of socks, was a small black notebook. Plain cover, no title, no label, the kind of thing easily lost or discarded without a second glance. James pulled it out and held it in both hands. The elastic band that once kept it closed had long since snapped, leaving a faint line pressed into the front. He opened it, and instantly, the smell of old paper met his nose. Warm, slightly musty, like the inside of a library that hadn't been dusted in a decade. The first page was dated 18 months ago, January 2nd. Saw the lump again in the mirror today. Still growing. Called Dr. Miller's office and canceled my appointment. Didn't feel like answering questions. James turned the page, fingers moving slower now. The entries were short, concise, written in the same steady hand as the letter, but colder somehow, more clinical. February 18th, pain when swallowing. Noticed blood again. Refused to go in. What's the point? Eleanor did everything right and still died in pieces. I'd rather go on my own terms. The words hit like small punches, not dramatic, not embellished, just resigned. Accepting. A man making peace with his own deterioration, as if it were simply a long overdue debt. March 3rd, told the pharmacist I had a prescription coming. Lied. Took leftover meds from Eleanor's drawer. Still work, sort of. Can sleep 3 hours straight if I time them right. James blinked hard, trying to focus on the lines, but they blurred for a moment. He turned to a later entry. May 9th. RJ turned 7 today. I forgot to send the card. Didn't know what to write anyway. From Grandpa feels false when you've only seen the kid 3 times. James doesn't need me in his life. Never did. That one cut deeper than the rest. It wasn't anger. It was absence. The hollow echo of a man who had convinced himself the door had long since closed, even if it hadn't. Further along in the journal, the entries began to change, not in tone, but in density. Shorter lines, larger spaces between them, as if writing had become harder or words had become more elusive. June 12th. Neck is worse. Vision blurry this morning. Hard to stand up straight. Looked it up online. Could be cancer, could be infection, could be nothing. Doesn't matter. James ran a hand through his hair, jaw clenched tight. He flipped back a few pages, looking for something, anything that might explain why Robert hadn't told him, why he had allowed things to get so far without asking for help. Then he found it. July 1st. Thought about calling James today. Picked up the phone, put it down. What would I say? Hey son, remember me? The guy who never came to your graduation, who missed your wedding, who didn't hold his grandson when he was born? He's better off without my voice in his life. Some silences are cleaner than words. That was the Robert James had grown up with, not cruel but distant, present in body but not in presence. A man whose heart was walled off long before age or illness had a say in it. James closed the notebook and sat back in the chair, letting it rest in his lap. His hands felt cold, even in the overheated room. For years he had assumed his father didn't care, that the silence was punishment, or worse, indifference. But reading these entries, seeing the pain filtered through ink and hesitation, he understood something else entirely. Robert hadn't stopped being a father. He had simply stopped believing he was allowed to be one. In the hallway, footsteps passed. The sound of heels on linoleum. A nurse calling for another patient. Life moving on, minute by minute. James looked at the notebook again, then placed it back in the bag. Not because he was done reading it, but because for now, he had read enough. Enough to feel the ache of a man who had suffered not just from illness but from the slow corrosion of loneliness. He stood and walked to the window. The city outside was still gray, still moving, but something in James had shifted. His father wasn't dead. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to give him a reason to want to stay. The hallway outside the hospital room was quiet, as if the air itself had paused to listen. James stood with his arms crossed, the bag still slung over one shoulder, the journal weighing heavy in his pocket like a secret not yet spoken. Behind the door, Robert slept, sedated, stable for now, hooked to monitors that blinked and beeped their quiet rhythms. His body lay still, framed by rails and wires. But James could feel the weight of his father's presence even in rest, a presence that had once felt unreachable. Now, suddenly, it was fragile, mortal, real. Doctor, Miller approached with a tablet in hand, and that same careful expression, measured concern mixed with clinical control. It was the face of someone used to delivering information to people who didn't want to hear it. We've reviewed the imaging, he said softly. It's a mass along the carotid sheath, as expected. Significant in size, but there's a clear boundary. No evidence of metastasis at this point. James absorbed the words slowly. So, it's not terminal? Miller hesitated for a second. Not yet. It's operable, with risks. But we're not dealing with an untreatable cancer. The larger issue is his current condition: malnutrition, weakened immune system, lack of care. He's been declining for a long time without support. James looked past the doctor, toward the window. Sunlight spilled across the linoleum in pale streaks, as if trying to reach into the darker parts of the building. He gave up, James said, more to himself than to Miller. The doctor nodded gently. That's what it looks like. James took a breath, the kind that came from somewhere deep in the chest, where fear and resolve wrestle for control. What would you do, he asked, if it were your father? Miller didn't answer immediately. He looked down, then back at James. I'd try to remind him what it means to be needed. James didn't reply. He just nodded and turned toward the room, his hand resting for a moment on the doorframe before pushing it open. Inside, the beeping of the monitor provided the only soundtrack. Robert lay beneath a thin hospital blanket, his mouth slightly open, the scarf folded neatly on the side table, useless now. James pulled the chair closer and sat, not saying anything at first. He watched his father breathe, slow, shallow but steady. The lump on his neck was more visible in this light, a swollen defiance of time and care. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the journal, held it, didn't open it. "Dad," he said quietly, not expecting a response. "I read it, not all of it, but enough." Still no reaction, James continued, his voice low, more steady than he felt. "You thought I didn't need you, that I was better off without you. Maybe you were right for a while, but you were wrong about one thing." He leaned forward, elbows on knees, fingers interlocked. "You're not a burden, not to me, not to Emma, not to RJ. You're not invisible, and you don't have to disappear just because you don't feel strong." His throat tightened. He swallowed hard, blinking at the sterile white wall opposite the bed. "You taught me how to hold things in, how to be silent, and I did for years, but I'm done with that now." He paused, breathing through the weight of his own words. "I'm not letting you go without a fight. If you won't fight for yourself, fine, but fight for me. For RJ, for the chance to be something again." The monitor beeped on, still steady, still silent. But something in Robert's face shifted, a tightening of the jaw, a flutter beneath the eyelid. Not much, but something. James stood and walked to the window. The light had shifted again, warmer now, falling in golden slants across the room. For a moment it looked like the living room in winter, the way it used to when Eleanor would pull back the curtains just before sunset, her hair catching the light like fire. He turned back and picked up the scarf, running his thumb along the edge. The fabric was soft, worn thin in places, a shield once, a hiding place. He set it down beside the pillow. "I'm staying," he said finally. "Not for the night, not for a few days, for as long as it takes." Behind him the door opened quietly. A nurse entered to check vitals, offered a nod, then withdrew. James didn't move. Outside, the city continued on. Sirens in the distance, footsteps in the hallway, another life being born, another ending somewhere else. But in this room, in this quiet space between decision and action, something had shifted, not healed, not yet, but turned. Like a ship, slow and deliberate, changing course. The air was crisper than expected for late September, the kind of cool that hinted at autumn but hadn't yet turned the leaves. The lake sat still as glass beneath a pale morning sky, unbroken and endless, mirroring the silence between father and son. James cast the line with practiced ease, the spool humming gently as the bait arced through the air and disappeared beneath the surface. Beside him, Robert sat wrapped in layers, a flannel shirt under a windbreaker, a knit cap pulled down low. The scarf was gone now. The lump had been removed 3 weeks prior. The scar remained, red and curved like a question mark just below his jawline. Neither of them spoke at first. This had been James's idea. After the surgery, once Robert had stabilized, and the doctors had cleared him to return home, James suggested the lake. Not the big one hours away, but the small one just outside town, the one they used to visit when James was a boy, when Robert still carried tackle boxes and packed peanut butter sandwiches in wax paper. Robert hadn't said yes right away, but he hadn't said no either. That was enough. The two sat on the edge of the dock, lines in the water, a thermos of black coffee between them. The mug in Robert's hand trembled slightly, but he gripped it tighter and said nothing. He hadn't brought up the hospital, nor the journal, nor the letter. Neither had James, not directly. But it was there, between them, like the lake, wide, quiet, and deep. James reeled in his line, checked the bait, cast again. The rhythm of it soothed him, as if muscle memory could bridge emotional distance. "Remember the time you dropped the cooler in the water?" James said finally, eyes still on the line. "All the sandwiches floated away like little boats." Robert snorted, half laugh, half cough. "Your mother was furious." James smiled. "She made that face like she was going to strangle you with the picnic blanket." Robert didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth twitched. It was the first expression James had seen on his father's face that resembled peace, even a sliver of it. "I was 10, James continued. "You taught me how to cast that summer. I hooked your hat on the first try." "That was a lucky shot," Robert muttered. James glanced sideways. "Maybe, or maybe I had good instincts." The silence that followed was warmer, not the kind that weighed down, but the kind that let something settle. Robert sipped from the mug. His hands were slower now, more careful, but they were still his hands. They hadn't given up on him yet. He cleared his throat. "You didn't have to do all this," he said quietly. "Stay." "Help." James kept his eyes on the water. "Yeah, I did." "Why?" The question wasn't defiant. It was genuine, honest. James took a long breath. "Because I didn't want RJ to grow up the way I did, thinking silence meant disinterest, thinking a man disappears when he starts to feel small." Robert didn't answer right away. He set the mug down beside him, stared out across the lake. I wasn't ready to be anyone's father when you came along, he said. I tried to be, just didn't know how. Your mother made it look easy. James nodded. She was the glue. She was the map. More silence. A bird skimmed the lake's surface, wings brushing water like fingers over piano keys. Somewhere across the shore, a dog barked once, then stopped. The day felt suspended in amber. I read the journal, James said after a pause. I didn't know you thought you were dying. Robert shifted slightly. I did. You weren't. I know that now. Another pause. A longer one. James turned toward his father. You could have told me. I thought it would hurt less if you didn't have to watch. It hurt more not knowing. Robert looked down at his hands, at the scar peeking from under the collar, at the pale skin freckled with age and time. I didn't think I deserved to be saved, he said softly. James reeled in his line and set the pole aside. He reached into the tackle box and pulled out the old pocket knife Robert had given him years ago, a birthday gift tucked into a brown envelope, handed over with a grunt and a nod. That knife had meant more to James than any birthday cake. He handed it back. Robert looked at it, confused. You gave me this when I turned 12, James said. You said, every man needs one thing that proves he can handle what life throws at him. Robert ran a thumb across the blade's hinge. It clicked open, still sharp. You're not done proving things, Dad, James said. Not to me, not to yourself. They sat in silence again, but this time it was enough. Robert didn't reply. He didn't need to. The sun had risen higher now, warm enough to cut through the chill. The surface of the lake shimmered gold. Robert picked up his fishing rod, adjusted the reel, and cast. The line flew in a perfect arc, slicing the morning light before vanishing into the water. Beside him, James smiled. The last fishing trip, perhaps, or maybe the first of many. The phone rang at 3:17 a.m. James had been asleep on the couch, his arm draped awkwardly over his chest, the TV still glowing in the corner with the soft flicker of a late-night documentary. The sound jolted him upright before his brain could catch up. It rang again. Sharp, insistent, unmistakable. He reached for it, heart pounding in that half-asleep, half-alert panic that only comes when the world breaks its own rules in the middle of the night. Hello, Mr. Harrison? A woman's voice asked, calm but clipped. Yes, this is James. This is St. Luke's Hospital. I'm calling about your father. James sat forward. What happened? There's been a complication. Post-operative infection. His vitals dropped sharply. We've stabilized him for now, but we need you to come in. The words didn't land all at once. They staggered into his chest, one after another, each heavier than the last. I'll be there in 15 minutes, he said, already grabbing his shoes. The drive was a blur, empty roads, red lights blinking like slow heartbeats. His mind filled with images he couldn't stop, the scar, the journal, the lake, the way Robert had looked yesterday, calmer than he'd been in years, almost at peace. Now that peace felt like a warning. A calm before a final storm. He parked illegally in front of the emergency entrance, didn't care, rushed through the doors, barely hearing the nurse at the desk before she pointed him toward ICU. The hallway smelled different at night. Less like antiseptic, more like waiting. Like the air itself knew it was holding its breath. Dr. Miller was already there, standing outside Robert's room with a chart in his hand and tiredness in his eyes. He spiked a fever around midnight, Miller said. Sepsis, most likely. The body's reacting harder than we expected. Age, prior neglect, it's made recovery more fragile. James stared through the window. Robert lay motionless, paler than before. The machines were louder now, as if straining. Is he? James swallowed. Is he going to make it? Miller exhaled. We're doing everything we can, but I won't lie to you, this is critical. He's not conscious right now. You can go in if you'd like. James didn't wait. The room was dimly lit, the glow from the monitors casting soft shadows on Robert's face. Tubes snaked from his arms, oxygen hissed in short puffs, and beneath the blanket, his chest rose and fell with mechanical regularity. James pulled the chair closer and sat down, resting his elbows on his knees. Hands clasped tightly. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then softly, "You told me not to watch you fall apart." His voice cracked, thin in the sterile quiet. "But I'm here anyway." He looked at his father's face, the same face he had grown up both resenting and revering. The strong jaw now slack, the eyes sunken, the lines deeper than he remembered. Age had come for Robert not gradually, but all at once, like a wave crashing against a cliff already cracked by time. "I don't know if you can hear me," James continued, "but I need you to come back." A monitor beeped steadily beside him. No change, no flicker. James leaned forward. "I'm not done, Dad. You can't leave now, not after everything, not after we finally started talking, even without words." His hands tightened. "RJ's birthday is next month. He's expecting you to be there. He doesn't know you almost missed his life. He just knows you're his grandfather." The machine let out a sharp tone, only for a second, then resumed its rhythm. James froze. A nurse peeked in, checked the monitor, gave a small nod, and closed the door again. James exhaled shakily. "You always said dying on your own terms was better than dragging people down with you. But what if that was just fear talking? What if we actually need you to be part of the mess?" He reached out and took his father's hand. It was cold, but not lifeless. "Please," James whispered, "don't let this be the last thing." Minutes passed, or hours. Time had lost its shape again. He closed his eyes, and then, faint, so faint he almost thought he imagined it, Robert's fingers twitched. Just once. Then again. James leaned closer, eyes wide. Robert's eyelids fluttered, barely, slowly. His breathing remained assisted, shallow, but something inside him had shifted. He wasn't gone. Not yet. James stayed by his side until morning. Recovery didn't come in grand moments or cinematic scenes. It came in fragments, in the slow drip of IV fluids, the soft murmur of nurses adjusting settings, the hiss of oxygen tapering from necessity to precaution. It came in silence. Robert lay still for 2 days after the fever broke. James sat beside him every hour he could, reading quietly, napping in the stiff chair, sometimes just watching the way his father's chest rose and fell, steady now. He'd brought the journal again but hadn't reopened it. There was no need. He already knew what it contained, a man's quiet unraveling, then his even quieter return. On the third morning, Robert opened his eyes. No words at first, just awareness. Recognition. He blinked slowly, then turned his head a fraction to look at James, who was seated at the window, nursing a cup of hospital coffee that had long gone cold. "You stayed," Robert said, his voice dry and cracked, barely above a whisper. James didn't look up right away. He took a sip, then met his father's gaze. "Of course I did." Robert closed his eyes again, not from fatigue but from something else, something like shame or perhaps humility, the kind of emotion that doesn't demand space but tries to shrink inside itself. The next days were slower. Speech came back in short bursts. Eating resumed with broth, then soft food. James helped with small things, adjusting the bed, brushing crumbs off the blanket, turning pages of the newspaper when Robert's hands trembled. They didn't talk about the journal, or the letter, or the night James got the call, but something had changed. The silence between them no longer felt like absence. It felt like understanding, like presence that didn't need proof. One afternoon, James brought RJ to visit. The boy stood shyly at the edge of the hospital bed, gripping a drawing he had made, a crooked house, a giant sun, and 3 stick figures labeled me, Dad, and Grandpa. Robert looked at it for a long time before nodding once and saying, "Looks like home." RJ beamed. James didn't speak. He didn't have to. Later that evening, when RJ had gone home with Emma, James and Robert sat by the window, watching the sky darken. The light outside faded to soft blues and gray, and the city lights below began to flicker on like fireflies in reverse. Robert broke the quiet. "I don't know what comes next." James took a long breath. "Neither do I, but I think that's okay." Robert nodded. "I used to think being strong meant keeping everything in, carrying it alone." He looked at his hands, thinner now but steadier. "It's heavier that way," James said. They sat in silence again, comfortable, full. That night, James stayed longer than usual. He watched his father drift to sleep, slower now, the lines on his face softer in the low light. The beeping of machines no longer sounded like warnings, just reminders that life, even when fragile, continues. James didn't cry. He didn't need to. He had wept in other ways, in the waiting, in the nights beside the machines, in the pages of a journal not his own. He had come full circle, not as a son seeking approval, but as a man recognizing another man's frailty and choosing love anyway. As he left the room, James turned back one last time. Robert was asleep, the drawing from RJ pinned to the wall beside the bed, crooked but proud. The journal remained in James's bag. He would read it again someday, but not tonight. Tonight there was no need to look back, only forward. It happened quietly, the way all meaningful things do. Nearly a year after the surgery, Robert Harrison passed away in his sleep. No alarms, no final words. just the soft exhale of a man whose body had finally caught up with a life that had fought long enough. James got the call at 6:42 a.m. The voice on the other end was gentle. "We're sorry for your loss," the nurse said. He went peacefully. There were no tears at first, no rush of grief, just stillness. James sat at the kitchen table, holding the phone in one hand, the other resting on the drawing RJ had made almost a year earlier. The house, the sun, the stick figures, still taped to the refrigerator, faded but intact. He whispered, "Thank you," though he wasn't sure if it was meant for the nurse, or his father, or some space in between. The funeral was small, intimate, a quiet service under a gray sky, attended by a few old friends, some neighbors, and James's family. Robert hadn't wanted much fuss, no music, no speeches, just a pine box and a patch of earth, and the comfort of not being alone at the end. James delivered a short eulogy, not from notes, but from memory. He wasn't loud, he said. He didn't take up space the way other men do. But he was here. He mattered, and in the end, he made sure we knew that. No one cried during the burial. But later that evening, after RJ had gone to bed and the dishes had been put away, James found himself in Robert's apartment, alone, once more. The apartment hadn't changed much in the past year. Robert had moved slowly through it after recovery, keeping it tidy, but never really making it new. It was still filled with remnants of a life lived mostly in quiet. On the nightstand beside his bed, James found it, a single envelope, unsealed, with his name written in Robert's familiar slanted handwriting. He sat down on the bed, turned on the lamp, and opened it. Inside was a letter, not long, not poetic, but honest. "James, if you're reading this, then I've gone, but I hope not before we had a few good days. I hope we laughed again. I hope you saw me, really saw me, not just for what I failed at, but for who I tried to be. I want you to know I was proud, even when I didn't say it. Especially when I didn't say it. I didn't leave anything behind worth much, no inheritance, no grand wisdom, but I leave you this, a better ending than the one I once planned, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, being your father counted for something good. Thank you for not walking away when you had every right to." Dad. James folded the letter slowly, pressed it against his chest, closed his eyes. He sat there a long time, not broken, not whole, but held together by something deeper than either. A few weeks later, James took RJ back to the lake. It was colder now, early spring, but the water still reflected the sky with the same quiet honesty. RJ tossed pebbles into the shallows, counting ripples, laughing each time the splash startled a bird nearby. James brought the old tackle box, not to fish, but to remember. Inside, wrapped in a cloth, was the pocket knife Robert had once given him. He showed it to RJ. "Your grandpa gave this to me when I was your age," he said. "Said every man needs something to remind him he can handle what life throws at him." RJ nodded solemnly, as if understanding more than he should. James smiled and passed the knife into his son's small hands. "Think you're ready for that?" RJ looked up. "Only if I can keep the tackle box too." James laughed. "Deal." They sat on the dock until the sun dipped low, the sky painted in streaks of orange and blue, and for the first time in a long time, James didn't feel like something had ended. He felt like something had been passed on. Sometimes, healing doesn't come in a single moment. It comes slowly, through presence, through forgiveness, through choosing to stay, even when it's easier to walk away. If this story touched something inside you, a memory, a relationship, a silence you've been carrying, then maybe it's time to reach out, to listen, or simply to be there for someone who no longer knows how to ask. Have you ever experienced a moment like James did? A turning point with a parent, a child, or someone you once thought was lost? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your story in the comments below, because sometimes your voice can help someone else begin their own healing. And if you found this story meaningful, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more emotional, powerful, and true-to-life stories that speak to the heart. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of each other,